Sylvester Stallone walked into one of the finest Italian restaurants in the city, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening and a good meal. But when a powerful businessman, Vincenzo Richi, decided that Stallone didn't deserve to sit at his table, things took a sharp turn. What started as a simple dinner quickly escalated into a high-stakes power play, one that Richi thought he could control. But Stallone? He wasn't the type to be intimidated. What happened next left everyone speechless. The dim lighting, the soft clinking of glasses, and the murmurs of high-profile guests created an air of exclusivity that few could experience. Stallone had been here before, always treated with the utmost respect. Tonight, however, something was different. As he sat at his table, enjoying a meal with his longtime friend Frankie Martelli, a retired boxer, he noticed the stares. Not the usual admiring glances, but the sharp, assessing looks of men who believed they owned places like this. At a table near the center of the restaurant sat Vincenzo Richi, an influential businessman with a reputation for always getting what he wanted. Surrounded by his associates, he exuded arrogance. His gaze settled on Stallone, his eyes narrowing slightly before he leaned toward his men and muttered something. Moments later, a waiter hesitantly approached Stallone's table, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his uniform. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter said softly, "I hate to disturb your meal, but we have a situation." Stallone, always composed, set his fork down and raised an eyebrow. "What kind of situation?" The waiter hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at Vincenzo's table, before clearing his throat. "Mr. Richi has requested that you and your guest relocate. He believes this table would better suit his party." Frankie scoffed, his fork clattering against his plate. "He believes? Is that how things work now?" Stallone remained silent for a moment, assessing the situation. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for his wineglass, took a sip, and let out a low chuckle. "Tell Mr. Richi," he said finally, his voice smooth and unwavering, "that he's welcome to find another table, or another restaurant." The waiter swallowed nervously, nodding quickly before retreating. Across the room, Vincenzo Ricci's expression darkened. He wasn't used to being denied anything, and it was clear that this wasn't about a table anymore, it was about power. He whispered something to one of his bodyguards, who immediately rose from his seat and strode toward Stallone's table. The restaurant quieted as the massive figure loomed over Stallone. "Mr. Richi doesn't like being ignored," the bodyguard said, his voice low but firm. "And he doesn't like waiting." Stallone, unbothered, slowly turned his gaze upward. Then he should have made a reservation earlier. The tension in the restaurant became palpable. Other guests exchanged glances, unsure of what would happen next. Frankie, amused but always ready for trouble, leaned in. "Sly, you want me to handle this?" Stallone smirked. "Nah, Frankie. Let's see where this goes." From across the room, Vincenzo watched with increasing irritation. He had expected Stallone to comply, maybe even apologize, but instead, the man wasn't budging. With a casual motion, Stallone leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against his wineglass. "You sure you want to do this here?" he asked the bodyguard. "Lot of people watching." The bodyguard hesitated for the first time. That was the moment the power dynamic shifted. Just then, the maitre d' appeared, clearly aware that this was turning into something the restaurant did not want to be associated with. He approached Vincenzo's table first, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. "Sir," he said carefully, "I must insist that we respect all of our guests. Perhaps this matter can be resolved more discreetly." Vincenzo scoffed. "Do you know who I am?" The maitre d' straightened. "I do. But do you know who he is?" The businessman's smirk faltered for the first time as the maitre d' gestured toward the entrance. A distinguished Italian man, one of the owners of the restaurant, had just walked in and was making his way straight toward Stallone's table. Vincenzo sat up straighter, suddenly aware that things were shifting out of his control. The owner, an older gentleman with a commanding presence, greeted Stallone warmly. "Mr. Stallone," he said with a nod, "it's always a pleasure to have you here. I trust everything is to your liking?" Stallone smiled. "So far, so good." The owner's eyes flicked toward Vincenzo's table, his polite expression darkening. He turned to Richi, his voice losing its warmth. "I believe we've had a misunderstanding, Mr. Richi." His tone was firm. "Mr. Stallone is a valued guest here. If you have an issue, I suggest you take your business elsewhere." A silence settled over the room. Vincenzo Ricci, one of the most influential businessmen in the city, was being dismissed. His jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table, but he knew there was nothing he could do. Without a word, he motioned to his men. They stood, adjusted their suits, and exited the restaurant. A few quiet murmurs spread through the dining area as the tension slowly lifted. Frankie let out a low whistle. "You really know how to clear a room." Stallone picked up his wineglass, taking another sip before grinning. Just another quiet night out. As if nothing had happened, he turned back to his meal, unbothered. And the rest of the restaurant? They just witnessed a lesson in power, patience, and knowing when to stand your ground. The tension had just begun to settle as Vincenzo Ricci and his men exited the restaurant, their forced retreat leaving behind an unspoken ripple through the crowd. The other high-profile guests, who had been silently observing the confrontation, exchanged glances, some amused, others impressed, and a few clearly unsettled by the way Stallone had turned the situation in his favor without even raising his voice. Stallone remained relaxed, completely unfazed, as if he had simply continued enjoying his meal without interruption. Frankie, however, wasn't done reveling in the moment. He leaned in, smirking. "Man, I thought that guy was gonna pop a blood vessel trying to intimidate you." Stallone shrugged, his deep voice calm. "Guys like that? They rely on people being afraid of them. The moment they realize someone isn't, they fall apart." Frankie chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, you sure let him fall apart in front of the whole place." As the maitre d' discreetly signaled the waiters to resume their service, the restaurant slowly returned to its usual luxurious atmosphere. Conversations resumed, though the energy had shifted, now carrying a mixture of awe and amusement. Then, something unexpected happened. A well-dressed older gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, approached Stallone's table, carrying himself with quiet confidence. His suit was impeccable, his silver hair neatly combed back. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, only respect. He stopped at Stallone's table, offering a nod. "Mr. Stallone." Stallone looked up, setting his fork down. "Evening." The man smiled. "That was quite something to watch. I have to say, you handled it like a true professional." Stallone simply chuckled. "I've had practice." The man extended a hand. "Leonardo Bellucci. My family's been dining here for over 30 years." Stallone shook his hand firmly. "Pleasure." Leonardo took a seat in the empty chair across from him, glancing around as if making sure no one was eavesdropping. He then leaned in slightly. "You do realize who that was, don't you?" Frankie exhaled sharply. "Vincenzo Ricci." "Yeah, we got the memo." Leonardo nodded. "And you probably know that men like him, they don't take embarrassment lightly." Stallone's face remained unreadable. "I didn't embarrass him. He embarrassed himself." Leonardo smirked, as if appreciating the response. "Still, I wouldn't be surprised if he decides to retaliate in some way. Men like Ricci don't walk away quietly." Frankie rolled his eyes. "What's he gonna do? Ban Sly from every overpriced restaurant in the city?" Leonardo gave a small chuckle. "Nothing so trivial. But I'd watch my back if I were you." Stallone met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "I always do." Leonardo studied him for a moment before nodding approvingly. "You know, Stallone, you remind me of the men my grandfather used to talk about. The kind who don't need to prove anything, but when the moment comes, they command a room with nothing but presence." Frankie grinned. "Oh, trust me, I've seen him do that in way worse places than an Italian restaurant." Leonardo chuckled again, clearly impressed. "Well, let's just say I'm glad I was here tonight. It's not every day you see someone put a man like Ricci in his place without lifting a finger." He stood up, straightening his jacket. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, gentlemen. If you ever need a favor in this city, well, let's just say you've earned one." With that, He gave a respectful nod and returned to his table. Frankie watched him go, raising an eyebrow. "So, we just made a new friend?" Stallone smirked. "Looks like it." Frankie leaned back in his chair, still grinning. "And an enemy?" Stallone shrugged. "One at a time." Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Vincenzo Ricci was not handling his public humiliation well. He sat in the back of his black luxury car, his jaw clenched, his hand gripping the armrest. His two bodyguards sat across from him, their faces unreadable, waiting for their next instructions. Finally, one of them spoke. "What do you want us to do, boss?" Ricci exhaled sharply through his nose, eyes narrowing. "Nothing. Not yet." The bodyguard hesitated. "Sir, if you—" Ricci raised a hand, cutting him off. His expression remained calm, but there was a cold edge to his voice. "Stallone thinks he can walk into my world and disrespect me? Fine, let him have his little moment." He turned, staring out the car window as they drove through the city streets. But this isn't over. Back inside the restaurant, Stallone had no idea that Ricci was already planning his next move. But as always, he wasn't the kind of man to worry about threats. Because when the time came, he knew exactly how to handle them. The night had moved on, and Stallone was enjoying the rest of his meal without further interruptions. Il Fiorentino had returned to its usual elegance, and while some diners were still whispering about what had happened earlier, most went back to pretending they weren't impressed by the way Stallone had handled Ricci. Frankie leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his wine in the glass. "So, do you think that guy's actually gonna try something? Or was that just him saving face?" Stallone smirked. "Men like Ricci don't just let things go. He's not the kind to take a public loss and walk away quietly." Frankie sighed. "Well, whatever he tries, I'm guessing it won't be a friendly apology." Stallone shrugged. "Won't be the first time someone tried to make a problem for me. Won't be the last either." They finished their dinner without further incident, paid the bill, and made their way outside. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the restaurant. Stallone took a deep breath, enjoying the moment. But Frankie, ever cautious, glanced around. "We good? No blacked-out SUVs lurking around the corner?" Stallone chuckled. "Relax, Frankie. Ricci's not stupid. He knows how bad it would look if something happened to me right after that little scene." Frankie nodded, but his gut told him this wasn't over. And he was right. Elsewhere in the city, Vincenzo Ricci sat in his private lounge, sipping an expensive glass of whiskey, deep in thought. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. In front of high-profile guests, in a place he considered his personal kingdom, he had been made to look like a fool. And worst of all, by someone who hadn't even tried to humiliate him. That was what made it worse. Stallone hadn't taunted him. He hadn't insulted him. He had simply stood his ground. And that alone had been enough to strip Ricci of his power. That was something Ricci could not allow to go unpunished. A tall, well-dressed man sat across from him. His name was Enzo Palladino, and if Ricci wanted something done quietly, he was the man to call. "This isn't just about ego," Ricci said, swirling the ice in his glass. "If I let this slide, people will think I've lost my edge. They'll think I've gone soft." Palladino nodded. "So, what do you want to do?" Ricci leaned forward, his expression cold. "I want Stallone to know he made a mistake. But I don't want it traced back to me." Palladino smirked. "I know just the way to send a message." The setup. 2 nights later, Stallone received a phone call from an old friend, an Italian filmmaker named Marco De Luca. "Hey Sly, listen, I know it's last minute, but I'm hosting a private event at one of my venues. Just a small gathering, some film people, old friends. You should come." Stallone hadn't seen Marco in a while, and he had nothing pressing on his schedule. "Sounds good. Where's it at?" Marco gave him the address, a private club in the heart of the city. Nothing about the invitation seemed suspicious. Marco wasn't the kind of guy to get mixed up in trouble. But what Stallone didn't know was that Marco hadn't called him. The voice on the phone? It was someone working for Ricci. And the moment Stallone walked into that club, he was stepping into a trap. The club. The venue was exclusive but discreet, one of those places where people with influence like to gather away from the public eye. The kind of place where deals were made, alliances were formed, and secrets were kept. Stallone arrived alone, dressed casually but still carrying the kind of presence that made people stop and take notice. A hostess greeted him at the door. "Right this way, Mr. Stallone." As he followed her inside, something felt off. The club wasn't nearly as busy as he expected, and the usual energy of a high-end gathering was absent. Then he saw them. At a private booth near the back of the club sat Vincenzo Ricci and Enzo Palladino, waiting for him. The moment Stallone realized this wasn't a film industry event, it was already too late to turn back. The hostess disappeared, leaving him alone with two men who clearly had something planned. Ricci smiled, his expression smooth but unreadable. "Sylvester. Glad you could make it." Stallone, unbothered, took a slow look around. Then, with a small smirk, he said, "I don't see Marco. Guess I was invited under different circumstances." Ricci gestured to the seat across from him. "Why don't you sit? Have a drink. We've got some business to discuss." Stallone didn't move. He already knew how this game worked. He also knew that somewhere in this club, backup was waiting. He glanced at Palladino, who was casually stirring his drink, watching him closely. Ricci leaned in slightly. "See, Stallone, you walked into my restaurant the other night and acted like you owned the place. That's not how things work in this city." Stallone raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" Ricci's expression darkened. "You embarrassed me." Stallone tilted his head slightly, his tone still calm. "No, I just didn't let you push me around." Palladino chuckled. "Doesn't matter how you see it, Stallone. What matters is that there's a price for making a man like Ricci look weak." Stallone sighed, shaking his head. "You guys are really overcomplicating things." Ricci smirked. "You think this is complicated?" He lifted a hand slightly, a subtle signal. The club doors locked. And from the shadows, 3 more men stepped forward. Stallone barely reacted, his mind already calculating his next move. He had been in situations like this before. The trick wasn't to fight first. The trick was to let them think you weren't worried. Because the moment they got too confident, that's when they'd slip up. Outside the club, Frankie Martelli pulled up across the street, having decided, on a hunch, to check on Stallone. He leaned forward in his car, watching the entrance. And he saw something that didn't sit right. The bouncers at the door weren't the usual high-end security guys. These were Ricci's men. And the door had just locked. Frankie muttered under his breath. "Ah, hell no." He reached for his phone, dialing a number as he stepped out of the car. If Ricci thought Stallone had walked into a trap alone, he had another thing coming. Because Stallone? He always had a way out. Inside the dimly lit club, the atmosphere had shifted. The low hum of conversation had faded, replaced by a tense silence. The moment the doors locked, everyone in the room knew, this wasn't a social gathering anymore. Sylvester Stallone remained seated, completely calm, as 3 additional men stepped out of the shadows, their presence making one thing clear: this was an ambush. Vincenzo Ricci, leaning back in his seat, smirked as he slowly stirred the whiskey in his glass. "You know, Stallone, I was thinking, maybe I was too harsh on you the other night. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot." Stallone didn't move. Locking the doors isn't usually how people start fresh. Ricci chuckled. "That's fair." He set his glass down and gestured slightly, and one of his men took a step closer to Stallone's chair. Still, Stallone didn't react. He had been in situations like this before, where men with too much money, power, and ego thought they could intimidate him. The trick wasn't to act tough. The trick was to let them talk. Let them get comfortable. Because comfortable men made mistakes. "You see, Sly," Ricci continued, his voice smooth, "what happened the other night? That wasn't just about a table. It was about respect. And you," he smirked. "You didn't show any." Stallone finally tilted his head, as if considering the statement. Then, casually, he responded. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Richi's smirk twitched, just slightly. The fact that Stallone was still so relaxed, so completely unimpressed, was starting to get under his skin. Enzo Palladino, Richi's right-hand man, let out a low chuckle. You talk real smooth for a guy in your position. Stallone finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice dropping slightly. I don't need to talk smooth, kid. I just need to talk once. The way he said it, the absolute certainty in his tone, sent a ripple through the room. For the first time, Richi's men exchanged glances, as if sensing something wasn't quite right. Richi, determined to stay in control, smirked again, though this time it looked a little more forced. You think I'm afraid of you? Stallone exhaled through his nose, the faintest hint of amusement in his expression. No, but you should be afraid of what happens next. Richi opened his mouth to respond. Bang! 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 Suddenly, loud pounding echoed through the club's main entrance. Everyone froze. More pounding followed, and then, the doors burst open. Frankie Martelli stormed inside, flanked by two unexpected guests, Luca Bellucci and Alessandro Russo, men whose names carried serious weight in the city's underground circles. And they weren't alone. Behind them stood four more men who weren't Richi's guys. Men who weren't here to back down. Richi's expression changed instantly. What the hell is this? He snapped, standing up so quickly his glass nearly toppled over. Frankie, grinning like a man who had just ruined someone's carefully laid plans, clapped his hands together. Well, Vinny, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You didn't think we'd let Sly walk into your little clubhouse without backup, did you? Richi's men shifted uncomfortably. They had been expecting one man. Now, they were outnumbered. Luca Bellucci, the well-dressed older gentleman from the restaurant 2 nights ago, stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm. Vincenzo, he said smoothly, I heard about what happened at Il Fiorentino. And I heard you didn't take it well. Richi clenched his jaw. This isn't your business, Luca. Luca raised an eyebrow. Oh, but it is. Because when a man starts acting reckless, it makes the rest of us look bad. The unspoken message was clear. Richi had embarrassed himself. And now, even his own allies were questioning his judgment. Richi glanced at Stallone, who was still seated, still completely at ease, watching everything unfold like he had known this would happen all along. Richi's grip on the back of his chair tightened. He had gone from predator to prey in less than a minute. Palladino, standing beside him, swallowed hard, sensing that this situation had flipped against them completely. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Stallone finally stood up. He adjusted his suit jacket, took his time, and then looked directly at Richi. You know, he said casually, if you'd spent less time trying to prove how powerful you are, you might have actually kept some of it. The room fell completely silent. The insult landed hard. Richi's face turned red, his nostrils flaring, but he knew he couldn't do a damn thing about it. Because now? Now, he wasn't just against Stallone. He was against everyone in the room. Finally, Luca spoke again, his voice smooth but final. Vincenzo, I think it's time you take a break from the city. Maybe visit your villa. Clear your head. Everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. Richi's hands curled into fists, his pride screaming at him to fight back. But he wasn't stupid. So instead, he gave Stallone one last glare, then turned to his men. Let's go. And just like that, they left. The moment they stepped outside, the tension broke. Frankie exhaled. Damn, that was almost fun. Stallone smirked. Almost. Luca turned to Stallone, nodding in approval. Not many people could have handled that the way you did. Stallone shrugged. Wasn't hard. Just had to let him talk long enough to dig his own hole. Luca chuckled. You ever think about running for office? Stallone shook his head. Nah, too much paperwork. The room erupted in laughter, and with that, the night was over. Vincenzo Richi? He was done. And Stallone? He had once again proved that true power isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to let others take themselves out of the game.